I didn't start plotting revenge the night my wife said, "Not tonight again," but that was the night I finally understood that the person lying beside me wasn't just tired. She was absent in the kind of way that makes you feel guilty for wanting anything at all. And I remember thinking, with this cold clarity that felt almost like relief, that if someone can starve you politely for long enough, they can train you to apologize for being hungry. We had been married long enough that our apartment held the shape of us: the paired toothbrushes, the shared grocery list, the framed photos from trips we never talk about anymore. And still the air between us had turned into something thin and careful, like we were both afraid that one wrong word would crack it open and flood the room with everything we had avoided. She lay on her side with her back to me, phone face down on the nightstand like a period at the end of a sentence, and when I shifted closer and let my hand hover near her waist, trying to remember how it used to feel when she would lean into me instead of away from me, she exhaled that practiced little sigh that somehow sounded kind and final at the same time, and she said, "Not tonight, okay? I'm just done. Please don't make it a thing," which is a sentence that can shrink a grown man down into a silent apology, even if he hasn't done anything wrong. I told myself I wasn't owed sex, because I wasn't, and I told myself that wanting it didn't make me a villain, because it didn't. But what kept clawing at me was the way intimacy had become an administrative request that she could deny with the gentleness of someone canceling a dentist appointment, and I could feel something inside me turning from sadness into a hard, patient focus that I didn't recognize yet, because revenge doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives like a light switching on in a room you've been stumbling through for months. Earlier in the evening, I had tried to be the version of a husband that earns warmth, the version that doesn't pressure, that listens, that carries half the weight without being asked. And I'd started the conversation the way every therapist and article tells you to start it, with "I feel" statements that taste like cardboard when you're already hurting. I said, "Can we talk for a second? Not even about sex exactly, but about us, because I feel like we're roommates who share a last name and a Netflix account, and I don't know when we stopped touching each other like we actually wanted to." And she didn't explode or cry or get dramatic, which would have been easier to hold on to, because at least then I could blame emotion. But instead, she looked at me like I'd interrupted her thoughts, and she said, "I'm not doing this conversation again. I'm exhausted, and you always make it sound like I'm failing you, and I'm not failing you. I'm just trying to breathe." And I remember my chest tightening because the words were smooth and reasonable, and I couldn't find a way in without sounding like a complaint she'd already filed away. I tried anyway, because something in me was desperate enough to keep walking into the same closed door, and I said, "I'm not accusing you. I'm telling you I miss you. I miss the way you used to look at me. I miss the way you used to pull me in like you couldn't wait." And for a second, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been guilt or annoyance or both, and she said, "Stop romanticizing the beginning. Real life isn't the beginning." And then she stood up and started stacking dishes like the conversation was just more clutter on the counter. When someone refuses you over and over while keeping their voice calm, it messes with your head, because you start doubting your own reality, and you start wondering if you're the one being unreasonable for wanting the thing married people are supposed to want with each other. And then you start telling yourself stories to survive, like maybe it's stress, maybe it's hormones, maybe it's a phase, maybe tomorrow will be different, while your body keeps remembering what it's like to be wanted and your mind keeps pretending you can outthink loneliness. So when we finally went to bed and she rolled over without touching me, pulling the blanket up to her shoulder like she was building a wall 1 inch at a time, I did what I'd trained myself to do, which was nod and act like it didn't matter, and then lie awake anyway, staring at the ceiling fan cutting slow circles through the dark, listening to her breathing deepen as if my need was a problem she'd already solved by ignoring it. My brain ran this humiliating math of all the nights I'd tried to initiate with a kiss that lingered a second too long, all the mornings I'd swallowed resentment with coffee because I didn't want to be the guy who keeps score, and all the times I'd watched her move around the apartment in a sweatshirt that used to be mine and thought, with this sharp, unwanted heat, that she was still beautiful, still the person I wanted, and that made the rejection hurt more, because attraction without reciprocity turns into its own kind of punishment. I kept replaying her sentence, Please don't make it a thing. Because it implied that my wanting closeness was the problem, and it made me wonder when intimacy became something she tolerated rather than something she chose. And I found myself asking questions I had avoided for months, like whether she had stopped wanting sex in general, or whether she had stopped wanting it with me, and what the difference even mattered if the outcome was the same cold space between our bodies every night. At some point, somewhere between midnight and that gray pre-morning hour when you can hear your own heartbeat too clearly, I made a quiet decision that scared me with how calm it felt, because I realized that if she could test my patience by withholding, then I could test her certainty by changing the rules she thought she controlled. And even though I didn't know exactly how yet, I knew I was done begging for scraps of affection like a dog waiting for a hand that never comes down to pet it. The first time her sister said my name in that hallway, it didn't sound like a greeting. It sounded like a door opening in a house that was supposed to stay locked, and my body reacted before my brain could pretend it was nothing. My wife was in the bathroom with the shower running, that steady hiss that fills an apartment the way static fills a radio, and I was drifting toward the kitchen for water because sleep had turned into this shallow, frustrating thing I kept failing at after another "not tonight," delivered with that careful, gentle tone that makes you feel like a criminal for wanting closeness. We'd been hosting Mara for a few days that were already turning into a week, and I'd been telling myself it was fine, because it's what you do when you're married to someone who insists family is everything, even when the marriage itself feels like it's been put on mute, and because Mara was polite in a way that made it hard to resent her, always rinsing her dishes, always offering to pick up groceries, always hovering at the edges of our conversations like she was watching a play she used to believe in. When she leaned against the guest room doorframe, she looked almost casual. Oversized t-shirt, bare legs, damp hair pushed back from her face, but her eyes weren't casual at all, because they held on to me instead of sliding away the way polite people's eyes do at midnight. "You're up again," she said, not accusing, not concerned, just observant, and I tried to keep my voice steady as if steadiness could keep boundaries intact. So I answered, "Yeah, I couldn't sleep. I'm just getting water, and you should probably try to rest too," which sounded like a script I'd rehearsed to keep my life from getting messy. She didn't move, and she didn't smile, and she didn't flirt in any obvious way, which somehow made it worse, because it felt like she was bypassing the usual signals and going straight for the truth of what she thought she saw. "It's strange," she said slowly, "watching two people live in the same place and still feel alone, because I used to think marriage was the part where loneliness ends, and then I blew up my own relationship, and I came here and I realized some people are lonely right next to each other. I should have shut it down. I should have said something like, 'That's not your business.' But the shower kept running, and the hallway stayed quiet, and I was tired enough that honesty felt like relief, so I only said, 'It's complicated,' which is the sentence people use when they don't want to admit they're hurting. Mara's gaze flicked over my face like she was reading the bruises no one could see, and she stepped closer, not rushing, not dramatic, just close enough that the air changed, and I could smell her shampoo, clean and sharp and too present in that dark corridor. Then she leaned in until the warmth of her breath brushed my ear, and her voice dropped into a whisper that didn't belong in a family home because it carried the kind of intention that wakes your skin up. "Unless you want it now," she murmured, and the words landed with a soft weight that still knocked the air out of me, because my mind tried to process 100 meanings at once, and none of them were safe, and my body betrayed me with that involuntary surge of adrenaline that feels uncomfortably close to desire. In that second, sex wasn't even the point. The point was that someone was looking at me like I mattered, like I wasn't a burden, like wanting to be touched didn't make me pathetic. And the dangerous part was how quickly my own loneliness wanted to reach for that feeling and hold it. I forced myself to take a step back without making it look like panic, because pride makes you perform even when you're terrified. And I said, "Mara, don't say that to me." And I made my voice firm enough that it couldn't be mistaken for negotiation. And I added, "I don't care what's going on in my marriage. I'm not crossing that line, and I'm not becoming a story people whisper about at family dinners." She didn't look embarrassed, and she didn't apologize, and that steadiness made my stomach twist. Because if it had been a stupid joke, she would have laughed, and if it had been a drunk mistake, she would have wavered. But she just watched me like she was waiting to see what kind of man I actually was when the room went quiet. "I'm not asking you to be a villain," she said in that same low voice. "I'm asking you if you're tired of pretending you don't want anything." The shower shut off in the bathroom, and the sound snapped the moment in half like a string pulled tight and cut, and Mara stepped back as if she'd never moved at all, as if she'd been standing there harmlessly the entire time. And when my wife opened the door a few seconds later and walked out wrapped in a towel, she glanced at both of us and smiled like nothing had happened, like the hallway wasn't still buzzing in my ears. "You guys okay?" she asked, casual, relaxed, and I heard myself say, "Yeah, just couldn't sleep," while Mara said, "We're fine," and the lie tasted identical in both our mouths. I went back to bed with water I didn't drink, sliding under the sheets beside my wife's sleeping bag, and I stared into the dark while my mind replayed the whisper again and again, trying to decide whether it had been a joke, a test, or something sharper that had just brushed past my life and left a mark. The morning after the whisper arrived like nothing had happened, which somehow felt worse than if everything had exploded, because there is a special kind of cruelty in watching the world move on while you're still stuck replaying a moment that won't sit still in your head. I woke up early, not because I felt rested, but because my body refused to sink back into sleep once my brain remembered the sound of Mara's voice in that hallway, the way it had slipped under my skin and stayed there like a question I didn't know how to answer. Sunlight crept through the blinds in thin, polite lines, and my wife lay beside me with her back turned, breathing evenly, the same posture she'd fallen asleep in, as if the night hadn't asked anything of her at all. And I remember thinking how strange it was that one sentence from another woman could feel heavier than years of shared routines with the person I'd married. I got out of bed quietly and moved through the apartment with that careful, guilty energy people have when they're hiding something they didn't even choose, and the smell of coffee hit me from the kitchen where Mara was already awake, humming softly like this was just another normal morning in someone else's life. She stood at the counter in leggings and a loose sweater, hair pulled back, mug warming her hands, and when she looked up and saw me, her expression didn't flicker with embarrassment or tension or recognition. It stayed completely neutral, almost friendly, like the kind of face you show a coworker you've never crossed a line with. "Morning," she said easily, as if she hadn't leaned close enough to whisper something that had kept me awake for hours, and I answered, "Morning," in the same tone, because I didn't know how to challenge a reality that pretended it had never cracked. We made small talk the way people do when they're trying to protect a fragile peace, about how my wife always slept in on weekends, about a cafe Mara wanted to try later, about nothing that mattered, and with every normal sentence, my confusion deepened, because if the whisper had been a mistake, she was covering it flawlessly, and if it had been intentional, she was pretending with a confidence that made me doubt myself. I watched her move around the kitchen, the casual way she reached past me for a spoon, the way she brushed crumbs into her palm without thinking, and I hated myself for noticing how comfortable she looked in our space, how at ease she seemed, because it fed this paranoid question I couldn't shake, which was whether I had imagined the whole thing as some desperate projection born out of months of rejection. When my wife finally wandered in, yawning and stretching, she kissed my cheek automatically and said, "You're up early," and then turned to her sister with a smile that felt strangely warm given how cold she'd been with me the night before, and she said, "Did you sleep okay? Or was he tossing and turning again?" Like my restlessness was a running joke they shared, and Mara laughed lightly and said, "I slept great. This place is quiet." And the word quiet echoed in my head like a challenge. I found myself studying my wife's face for signs of something, jealousy, suspicion, tension, but there was nothing there except relief, and that relief unsettled me more than anger ever could have, because it suggested she wasn't worried about boundaries at all. The rest of the morning unfolded with the kind of mundane perfection that makes you feel crazy for being disturbed. Grocery lists scribbled on scrap paper, plans mentioned and half made, my wife suggesting almost cheerfully, that Mara should stay through the weekend because it would be nice to have company. And each time she said it, I felt that whisper twist again inside my chest, not as desire, but as disbelief. I kept waiting for Mara to look at me differently, to let something slip in her eyes, to acknowledge the moment we'd shared in the dark hallway. But she treated me like a brother-in-law she'd never crossed a line with. And the more normal she acted, the more I questioned my own memory, because loneliness can do dangerous things to your perception. And I knew that. I knew how the mind can invent significance where there is none, especially when sex has become this rare, fragile thing in your life that feels loaded with meaning. At one point, when my wife stepped into the bedroom to take a call, Mara and I were alone again, the kitchen filled with the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of mugs, and I almost said something, almost asked, "About last night?" But the words stuck, because I was suddenly terrified of hearing her say, "What are you talking about?" and realizing that the moment I'd been carrying around like a secret weight only existed in my head. She caught me looking at her, and for a split second, something unreadable crossed her face. Not flirtation, not guilt, just a kind of quiet assessment, and then she smiled politely and asked if I took sugar in my coffee, and the question felt like a dismissal disguised as courtesy. By the time I left for work, my nerves were frayed in a way that felt disproportionate to reality, because nothing concrete had happened, and yet everything felt unstable, like the ground under my marriage had shifted a few inches without warning. I drove to the office replaying the whisper, the morning, my wife's calm encouragement, and I kept circling the same thought, which was that if Mara had crossed a line, she'd erased it beautifully, and if she hadn't, then I was confronting something even more unsettling, which was how desperate I'd become for someone, anyone, to acknowledge that I was still a sexual being, and not just a convenient presence in someone else's life. That uncertainty followed me through the day like a shadow, and by the time I came home to another evening that promised routine and politeness and unspoken things, I realized that the real tension wasn't between me and Mara at all. It was between the story I was telling myself to survive and the reality I was too afraid to confront, and that gap was where something dangerous was quietly starting to take shape. By the fourth day of Mara staying with us, my wife's distance had settled into something so smooth it almost looked like peace, and that was what unsettled me the most, because peace usually comes after a storm, not in the middle of one you're pretending doesn't exist. That evening unfolded with an eerie domestic harmony, the three of us cooking dinner together like a staged photograph of normalcy, my wife moving around the kitchen with an ease I hadn't felt from her in months, humming to herself, brushing past Mara with casual affection, touching her arm lightly when she laughed as if she were relieved to have someone else absorbing the emotional bandwidth she no longer spent on me. At one point, while stirring a pot she didn't really need to stir, she said, "You know, you really should stay a bit longer. It's actually nice having you here." And the way she said it, open and unguarded, made my stomach drop, because there was no tension in her voice, no territorial edge, no sign of concern about boundaries or appearances, just a genuine ease that felt like detachment from the marriage itself. I watched Mara's face as she absorbed that invitation, and for the briefest moment, her eyes flicked to mine with something like surprise, or maybe calculation, before she smiled and answered, "If you're sure, I don't want to be in the way." And my wife laughed softly and said, "You're not in the way at all, honestly. It's good for him too. He's been so quiet lately," which landed like a small, precise cut, because it framed my silence as a personality quirk instead of the byproduct of months of being shut out. After dinner, when Mara excused herself to call a friend, my wife and I were alone in the living room, the TV murmuring something neither of us was watching, and I decided to test the water, not about sex, not directly, but about us, because I needed to understand what this calm really meant. I turned toward her on the couch and said, "You seem lighter lately, like something's shifted for you." And she didn't bristle or deflect the way she usually did. She just nodded slowly and replied, "I guess I am lighter, because I've stopped fighting myself about things I can't force." And I asked carefully, "Things like wanting me?" and the room went quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the TV filling the space where an answer should have been. She looked at me then, really looked, and there was no cruelty in her expression, only a kind of emotional distance that felt worse than anger. And she said, "I don't think it's fair to reduce everything to sex, like that's the only measure of closeness, because I'm close to you in other ways." And I remember feeling this bitter urge to laugh, because closeness without desire had started to feel like a consolation prize I never agreed to compete for. I told her, "I'm not reducing it, I'm naming it, because intimacy isn't a switch you flip off without consequences." And she sighed, not irritated, just tired, and answered, "I'm not turning anything off. I'm just not pretending anymore, and I wish you wouldn't take that as rejection," which sounded reasonable enough to doubt my own feelings, even as something inside me hardened. Later that night, when Mara returned from her call and joined us again, my wife's demeanor didn't change, and that consistency was the strangest part, because it suggested she wasn't monitoring anything, wasn't worried about optics, wasn't protecting territory, and I started to realize that her detachment wasn't about trust in me, it was about disengagement from the whole dynamic. When she went to bed early, claiming a headache with a softness that almost sounded apologetic, she kissed my cheek and said, "Don't stay up too late, okay?" Like a mother reminding a child to sleep. And then she added, "You and Mara can watch whatever you want," as if granting permission for something I hadn't asked for. Mara and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between us heavy with everything unsaid, and while we talked about harmless things, shows we liked, places she might move next, I kept noticing how my wife's absence filled the room more than her presence ever had, and that awareness stirred something dangerous in me. Not lust exactly, but a sharpened clarity about where I stood. When I finally went to bed alone, because my wife had already fallen asleep facing the wall, I lay there listening to the quiet apartment and understood that her calm wasn't relief at having company. It was relief at not having to engage, and that realization planted the first real seed of revenge in me, because I saw, with unsettling clarity, that she was comfortable watching me be tested, questioned, and displaced emotionally, as long as she didn't have to confront what she'd withdrawn. I didn't mean to overhear the conversation that finally rearranged everything. But the truth is, it probably wouldn't have mattered if I had planned it, because once suspicion takes root, your attention sharpens on its own, and that afternoon my instincts dragged me down the hallway before my conscience could stop me. I'd come home early, the kind of early that feels like a small rebellion against routine, hoping to catch my wife off guard and maybe, just maybe, remind her that I still existed outside of shared calendars and polite distance. And when I heard voices drifting from the guest room, low and deliberate, I slowed without thinking, every nerve in my body tuning itself to the cadence of something important unfolding. The door wasn't fully closed, just enough to create the illusion of privacy, and I stood there with my hand on the wall, heart thudding in a way that had nothing to do with sex and everything to do with dread, as Mara said my name in a tone that was stripped of playfulness and loaded with unease. "I don't like this," she was saying, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard before. "I told you it was a bad idea because he's not stupid, and this isn't a game you can control once you start it." My wife answered calmly, too calmly, the way she does when she's already decided she's right, and she said, "I didn't ask you to seduce him. I asked you to say one thing, one ambiguous thing, and then leave it alone, because I needed to know how he'd react when given an opening." And my stomach dropped so hard it felt like the floor tilted under me. Mara pushed back, her frustration clear now, and said, "You didn't tell me it was a test. You made it sound like you just wanted to shake him up. And now he's walking around confused and quiet, and I feel like I crossed a line I can't uncross." And my wife exhaled slowly, the sound of someone managing impatience, and replied, "You didn't cross anything because he didn't take it anywhere. And that's exactly the point. Because if he had, then I would have known something I needed to know." And hearing myself reduced to a variable in an experiment ignited something cold and furious in my chest. I pressed myself closer to the wall, the word test echoing in my head like a verdict, And I listened as my wife continued, I needed proof, Mara, because every time I say no, I can see the resentment building in him, and I needed to know if that resentment would turn him into someone who would cross a boundary the second he thought he could get away with it. Mara shot back, or maybe it's turning him into someone who's just lonely, and you're punishing him for still wanting you. And there was a pause after that, a thick, telling silence, before my wife said, wanting me doesn't give him ownership over my body, and I'm allowed to protect myself. And the words landed with a familiar chill, because they were technically true in a way that erased everything else. I stepped back quietly, retreating before the floor could betray me with a creak, and I returned to the living room with a composure that felt borrowed from someone else, because something fundamental had snapped into place and rearranged the story I'd been telling myself. The whisper in the hallway hadn't been an accident or a moment of shared vulnerability, or even a misjudged flirtation born of her sister's pain. It had been a controlled provocation designed to measure my worthiness, my loyalty, my restraint, all while pretending to trust me. I sat on the couch staring at nothing, replaying the last few days with this new lens, my wife's calm encouragement of Mara staying longer, her lightness, her lack of jealousy, and I saw the pattern so clearly it made me dizzy, because she hadn't been disengaged. She'd been observant, watching me navigate a trap she'd set with surgical precision. When they emerged from the guest room later, my wife smiling, Mara subdued, I met their eyes with what I knew was a convincing mask, because anger is loud and satisfying, but patience is quieter and far more dangerous. Everything okay? My wife asked, her tone casual, and I smiled back and said, yeah, just tired, long day. And in that moment, something shifted, because I realized that I had passed her test by doing nothing, and in doing so, I had learned exactly how little trust actually existed between us. I didn't confront her then, and I didn't explode or demand explanations, because revenge, I was starting to understand, isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about letting someone believe their experiment worked, while you quietly design one of your own. The confrontation came not as an explosion, but as an exhausted surrender, because once you realize you've been living inside someone else's experiment, the anger burns hot for a while and then settles into something colder and more deliberate. It happened late that night, after Mara had retreated to the guest room and the apartment had gone quiet in that artificial way that only happens when everyone is pretending to sleep, and my wife lay beside me staring at the ceiling instead of turning away like she usually did, as if she already knew the performance was over. I broke the silence by saying her name in a tone that carried no accusation, just certainty, and she stiffened immediately, because there is something unmistakable about being seen. I know about the test, I said, not raising my voice, not dramatizing it, because I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of thinking this was just another emotional outburst she could manage, and she exhaled slowly like someone deciding whether to keep lying or finally put the cards on the table. She didn't deny it, and that alone felt like a betrayal layered on top of the first one, because it confirmed how little I'd mattered in the equation, and she turned her head toward me and said, I didn't want it to come out like that, but yes, I needed to know. And the phrase needed to know rang in my ears like a justification she'd rehearsed until it sounded reasonable. I asked her what exactly she thought she was protecting herself from, and she answered with a kind of brittle honesty that surprised me, telling me that every time I touched her, every time I tried to initiate sex, she felt this internal pressure that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with control, with fear, with a resentment she didn't know how to name without sounding cruel. She said, it stopped feeling like desire and started feeling like obligation, and once that happens, it's terrifying, because you start to feel like your body isn't yours anymore. And I listened, really listened, because I wanted to understand even as my chest ached with the unfairness of it. She admitted that she'd been saying, not tonight, not because she was tired or stressed, but because saying yes felt like surrendering something she'd spent years building walls around, and instead of talking to me about it, she'd chosen distance, because distance felt safer than honesty. When I asked her why she involved her sister, why she turned our marriage into a psychological maze, she looked away and said, because I needed proof that you wouldn't cross a line if given the chance, because part of me was convinced that the only thing keeping you faithful was lack of opportunity. And hearing that cut deeper than any rejection, because it revealed how thoroughly she'd rewritten me in her mind. I told her she'd gotten her proof, that I'd passed her test by doing nothing, and she nodded, tears pooling in her eyes like that was supposed to mean something. And she said, "That's why I feel lighter, because now I know you're safe." And the word safe landed wrong, because it reduced me to a risk factor instead of a partner. I said, quietly but firmly, "You don't get to manipulate me and then feel relieved about it, because what you did wasn't trust, it was control." And for the first time since this started, she didn't have a ready response. She admitted that she'd been terrified of intimacy, because intimacy meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant losing the upper hand she'd built to protect herself from being hurt again, even if that protection meant hurting me instead. And she said, "I thought if I could prove you weren't like everyone else, I could finally relax." And I couldn't help but notice the irony, because in trying to prove my loyalty, she'd destroyed the very foundation it was supposed to rest on. We lay there in the dark with all of it exposed, the sexless nights, the resentment, the test, the quiet cruelty of watching me navigate a trap designed to measure my worth. And when she reached for my hand, the gesture felt almost foreign, like muscle memory trying to reassert itself after months of neglect. I didn't pull away, but I didn't squeeze back either, because something fundamental had shifted, and while I'd passed her test, she had failed one of her own without realizing it, and as I stared into the darkness, listening to her breathing turn uneven with regret, I understood that the revenge wouldn't come from yelling or leaving or cheating. It would come from letting her finally see me clearly, not as a safe option, not as a controlled variable, but as someone who could choose, because the moment she stopped controlling the narrative was the moment the balance of power quietly began to change. Passing her test didn't bring relief, it brought fallout, the kind that settles into your bones and changes how you move through your own home, because once manipulation is named, it never goes back into hiding. The days after that conversation felt heavier than the weeks before it, because now there was no ambiguity to hide behind, no plausible deniability, just the raw knowledge that two people I trusted had quietly coordinated to observe me like a subject rather than meet me like a partner. My wife tried to act normal, tried to bridge the gap with soft gestures that felt rehearsed, a hand on my arm when she spoke, a casual question about my day, even a tentative kiss that lingered a second longer than usual. But every touch carried the aftertaste of calculation, and I couldn't unfeel it. I caught myself studying her the way she'd studied me, listening for subtext, watching for motive, and I hated that this was who I was becoming in my own marriage, someone alert instead of affectionate, measured instead of open. Mara, on the other hand, withdrew in a way that was impossible to miss, staying in the guest room longer, volunteering to run errands alone, suddenly careful about space and eye contact, and the guilt hung off her like a coat she couldn't take off, because she knew she'd been used as an instrument in something that had gone further than she'd agreed to. One evening, when my wife was out picking up dinner, Mara finally broke, cornering me in the kitchen with a voice that trembled despite her attempt to sound composed, and she said, "I need you to know that I didn't think it would turn into this, and I wouldn't have done it if I knew she was testing you." And I believed her, not because she deserved absolution, but because her discomfort was real in a way my wife's justifications weren't. I told her I knew, that I'd overheard enough to piece it together, and she flinched like the truth itself had weight, and she said, "I feel disgusting, like I crossed a boundary that wasn't even mine to touch." And for a moment, I saw her not as a catalyst for chaos, but as another person tangled in my wife's need for control. There was still tension between us, a residue of that whisper that couldn't be erased, because attraction doesn't disappear just because it was misused, and I won't lie and pretend my body hadn't noticed her, because it had, because months of rejection will tune you to any frequency that sounds like desire, but that tension now felt poisoned by context, stripped of whatever dangerous appeal it once had. My wife sensed the shift immediately, because control freaks always do when they're losing the narrative, and she confronted Mara that night with a sharpness I hadn't heard before, accusing her of making things weird and overstepping, as if the original plan hadn't been hers. And I watched from the doorway as the two of them argued in low, furious tones, my wife insisting she'd done nothing wrong, Mara insisting that tests don't prove love, they only prove fear, and something about seeing them clash snapped the last thread of patience I'd been holding on to. I stepped in and said, "You don't get to be angry that the experiment had side effects." And the room went still, because I wasn't raising my voice, I wasn't pleading, I wasn't explaining, I was stating a fact, and that scared her more than anger ever could have. She tried to defend herself, talking about boundaries and safety and trauma like shields, and I let her talk until the words ran out, because I wanted her to hear how empty they sounded when stripped of context and accountability. That night, lying in bed with the space between us charged and silent, I realized that whatever version of our marriage had existed before the test was already gone, and what remained was a power struggle neither of us had openly agreed to, but both of us were now participating in. I felt betrayed not just by the manipulation, but by how easily she'd justified it, how quickly my pain had been reframed as a threat she needed to neutralize, and that betrayal sharpened into resolve, because if she wanted to live in a marriage built on observation and control, then she was about to learn what it felt like to be on the other side of that dynamic. I didn't shout. I didn't leave. I didn't cheat, because revenge doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits, patient and clear-eyed, until the person who thought they held all the cards realizes the game has quietly changed. Mara told me the truth 2 nights later, not because she wanted to unburden herself, but because the weight of what she'd helped create had started to crack something in her, and guilt has a way of forcing honesty when silence becomes unbearable. We were alone in the living room again, the same couch, the same dim lamp, but the air felt different now, stripped of performance, and when she sat down across from me instead of beside me, I knew this wasn't going to be another apology wrapped in excuses. She folded her hands together like she needed them to stay still and said my name with a steadiness that took effort, then followed it with, "There's something you don't know, and it's worse if I keep pretending it was all just her idea." And that sentence alone made my chest tighten, because it suggested layers I hadn't accounted for. I didn't interrupt her, because I'd learned that the most dangerous truths come out when you don't rush them. And after a long breath, she admitted that the whisper hadn't been fully fake, not in the way my wife thought it was, because while she'd agreed to say something provocative as part of that test, the words she chose had come from somewhere real. She told me that watching our marriage from the inside had stirred something ugly and familiar in her, not desire exactly, but envy so sharp it felt like grief, because she'd just come out of a relationship where she'd begged to be seen, to be wanted, to be touched, and hearing my wife casually turn me away night after night had triggered a resentment she hadn't known where to put. She said, "I wasn't trying to steal you, and I wasn't fantasizing about sex with you the way this probably looks. But when I leaned in and whispered that, part of me was thinking, what if someone wanted me the way you want her? What if I could feel powerful instead of disposable for 1 second?" And that honesty landed heavier than seduction ever could have. She admitted that the moment had carried her pain more than attraction, that she'd projected her own failed intimacy onto our marriage and used me as a mirror for everything she felt she'd lost. And hearing that reframed the whisper in a way that drained it of its erotic charge and replaced it with something sadder and more human. I could see how hard it was for her to say this without collapsing into shame, and while it didn't absolve her, it explained the strange mixture of confidence and restraint she'd carried afterward, because she'd crossed a line she hadn't fully meant to cross, and then spent days pretending it hadn't mattered. She looked at me then, eyes glossy but direct, and said, "I need you to know that I envied you more than I wanted you, because you still believed intimacy was something you could ask for. And I'd already given up on that." And there was no manipulation in her voice now, only fatigue. I didn't comfort her, and I didn't condemn her either, because both would have been dishonest. And instead I told her calmly that being used as a symbol in someone else's breakdown was still a violation, even if it came from pain instead of malice. She nodded, accepting that without argument, and said she was leaving in the morning, not because anyone had asked her to, but because staying meant continuing to orbit a marriage that was collapsing under the weight of unspoken things. When my wife came home later and sensed the shift immediately, Mara didn't explain herself. She just said she needed space, and the relief on my wife's face was unmistakable, which told me more than any confession could have. That night, lying in bed with my wife beside me, I felt something settle into place, because the second twist hadn't been about forbidden desire at all. It had been about realizing how many people had been using my silence to process their own damage, and how none of them had considered the cost to me. That realization didn't make me cruel, but it made me precise, because revenge doesn't always mean hurting someone back. Sometimes it means refusing to be the emotional landfill for everyone else's unresolved mess. And I could feel the final pieces of the dynamic shifting, quietly and irreversibly, into my hands. The day Mara left, the apartment didn't feel quieter. It felt exposed, like someone had peeled off a layer of wallpaper and revealed cracks we'd been decorating around for years. And when I watched her suitcase wobble over the threshold and heard the elevator swallow her footsteps, I didn't feel relief so much as a hard, sober clarity that there were no more buffers left, no more third person to absorb the tension, no more hallway moments to blame for the way my chest tightened every time my wife looked through me instead of at me. My wife stood at the window for a while, arms folded, pretending she was just watching the street, and I could see the shape of her thinking in her posture, that old need to control the narrative before it controlled her. And I realized I had been waiting for that need to break like a fever, because I couldn't keep living in a marriage where my desire was treated like a threat that needed containment. I didn't start that conversation with a speech or an ultimatum, because I'd learned that drama gives people something to hide behind, and I wanted her naked in the only way that matters, which is emotionally. So I sat across from her at the dining table and said, "I'm done doing this the way we've been doing it, because I can't live on hints and tests and polite rejection that gets called boundaries after the fact." And the moment I said it, the room shifted, because I wasn't pleading and I wasn't accusing. I was stating something that wasn't up for debate. She tried to soften it at first, tried to steer it into safer language, saying, "I know it's been hard, and I know you feel neglected, but you have to understand." And I cut in gently but firmly, because I wasn't going to let her turn it into another explanation that left me carrying the emotional bill, and I said, "I understand your fear. I understand your control. I understand that 'not tonight' can be honest. But what I don't understand is how you could look at me every day and decide the best way to handle what's happening between us was to set a trap and measure me like I'm a risk you manage instead of a husband you trust." Her face tightened, and she looked down at her hands like she could rearrange the facts by rearranging her fingers, and she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you. I just needed to feel safe." And that word hit me like it always did, because it was true enough to sound righteous and vague enough to erase my experience. So I leaned forward and said, "Do you know what it feels like to be someone's safe option? To be looked at like you're acceptable as long as you behave? To have your own sexuality treated like a suspicious animal that needs a leash? Because that's what you've turned me into in this house." She swallowed, and for a second I saw something like panic, because control only feels good until it stops working. And I could tell she was realizing that her usual tools, the calm voice, the reasonable phrasing, the gentle dismissal, weren't moving me the way they used to. We talked for hours, and it wasn't neat, because real resentment doesn't come out in tidy paragraphs. It comes out in waves that carry old memories to the surface like debris. And I told her about the nights I'd lain awake staring at the ceiling fan, not even thinking about sex like some animal, but thinking about the way she used to reach for me without calculation, the way she used to look at me like she wanted me, and how that absence had turned my own desire into a kind of shame I kept swallowing just to keep peace. I told her that I wasn't angry that she sometimes didn't want sex, because I'm not owed it, but I was furious that she turned my wanting into a character flaw, that she watched me shrink and called it maturity, that she used silence as a weapon, and then acted surprised when I started moving like someone who had learned not to ask. She admitted things she hadn't admitted without shielding them in therapy speak, saying, I don't know when wanting you started to feel like giving up control, but it did, and then I started resenting you for wanting what I couldn't give without feeling trapped. And I listened, because I wanted truth more than comfort, even if the truth hurt. And I answered, I didn't trap you. I asked you to meet me, and you responded by building a system where I had to prove I deserved you. She asked me what I wanted now, and the fear in her voice wasn't just about losing me. It was about losing the structure she'd built to avoid vulnerability. And I said, I want to stop performing for you. I want to stop auditioning to be treated like a husband. I want to stop living in a house where I'm constantly guessing whether I'm loved or just tolerated. And I watched her flinch because she realized that the power had shifted in a way she couldn't reverse with one apology. When she reached for my hand, I didn't yank it away like a dramatic gesture, but I didn't clasp back either, because I wanted her to feel, in her body, what it's like when touch is no longer guaranteed. And I said, I'm not punishing you. I'm just done chasing you. And from now on, I'm going to decide whether this marriage is a place I can actually live or just a place where I slowly disappear. And the quiet that followed wasn't the old avoidance. It was the sound of someone finally realizing that tests don't build trust. They burn it, and that I wasn't going to be managed back into my role no matter how gently she asked. It took weeks after that conversation for the final moment to arrive, because endings rarely show up on schedule. They wait until everyone is tired enough to stop pretending, and by then, the truth feels almost gentle in comparison to the work it took to avoid it. We lived in a strange in-between for a while, sharing space without scripts, speaking when there was something real to say, and letting silence exist without trying to weaponize it. And that alone changed the atmosphere of the apartment more than any apology ever had. My wife stopped managing me, and I stopped chasing her. And in that vacuum, something honest finally surfaced. Not passion, not resentment, but a clear-eyed awareness of what was left when control and avoidance were stripped away. One night, after dinner sat untouched between us because neither of us was hungry in the way food fixes, she looked at me and said, I don't know how to reach you anymore. And I answered, without heat and without cruelty, you don't reach someone you've been holding at arm's length. You decide whether you're willing to step closer without a leash. And the simplicity of that seemed to exhaust her more than any argument. She admitted that losing control felt like standing on the edge of something she couldn't calculate. That intimacy scared her not because of sex itself, but because sex meant wanting without guarantees, and wanting without guarantees meant risking rejection. And for years, she'd made me carry that risk alone. I told her that I'd been living inside that risk quietly, night after night, and that the revenge she feared, the affair, the explosion, the betrayal she'd tested me for, had never interested me as much as the freedom of no longer needing her approval to know who I was. The final decision didn't come with shouting or tears. It came with a question she asked in a voice that finally sounded unguarded, when she said, So what happens now? And I remember noticing how different that felt from all the times she'd asked what I wanted while still holding the rules. I didn't answer immediately, because I wanted the truth, not the reactive thing that would satisfy an audience. And after a long pause, I said, Right now, I choose myself. And the phrase hung there between us, heavy and irreversible. I explained that choosing myself didn't automatically mean leaving or staying. It meant no longer shrinking, no longer accepting a version of love that required me to be less alive, less sexual, less present, just to keep the peace. She asked if that meant the marriage was over, and I said, It means the marriage either becomes real, with desire and fear and agency on both sides, or it ends without lies. And the calm in my voice surprised even me, because revenge had done its work quietly, shifting the balance until I wasn't asking to be chosen anymore. She cried then, not because she was losing me in that moment, but because she understood that control had finally failed her, and that whatever happened next would have to be mutual, or not happen at all. We didn't have sex that night, and that was the strangest part, because for the first time in a long time, not having sex didn't feel like rejection or power or obligation. It just felt like a choice neither of us was making out of fear. When she turned toward me in bed and rested her head against my shoulder without expectation, I let her, not because I was conceding ground, but because I wasn't guarding myself anymore either. And that was the quiet irony of it all. The whisper that had started everything had promised right now as temptation, as escape, as a shortcut out of loneliness. But the real right now turned out to be something far less dramatic and far more dangerous, which was the willingness to sit in truth without a test, without a script, without needing to win. I don't know yet whether this marriage survives in a form that includes sex, desire, and mutual vulnerability, or whether it ends with dignity and distance, but I do know that the revenge I needed was never about making her hurt the way I had. It was about refusing to be managed, measured, or minimized ever again. If you're reading this because you've been betrayed quietly, politely, under the language of safety and reason, understand this. The most satisfying revenge isn't destruction, it's clarity. And the moment you stop asking for permission to exist fully is the moment the entire dynamic finally breaks in your favor.